They told me it was just business. That's the phrase they used, like it was supposed to make me feel better. Just business, as if 23 years in HR at St. Joseph Medical Center could be wiped clean with a single signature. My name's Michael Lawson. I'm 52 years old. For more than 2 decades, I was the senior HR manager for one of the largest nonprofit hospital systems in our region. I'm the guy who knew every clause of every policy. I wrote half of them myself. That's what made it so insulting when they called me in on a Tuesday morning and told me my approach was no longer a cultural fit. It was quiet in that small conference room. The blinds were drawn like they were ashamed to let daylight in on what they were doing. Janet, the director of HR services, sat across from me with a manila folder in her hands she wouldn't meet my eyes over. She had a new haircut. I remember noticing that because I'd approved her tuition reimbursement for HR certification last year. I didn't interrupt when she read from the script. I didn't say a word while the VP of operations stood at her shoulder arms folded like he was waiting for me to blow up. That was the plan, I think, to get me shouting red-faced so they could escort me out and prove their point about me being combative. I didn't give them that satisfaction. I sat there listening, hands folded in my lap, and just took note of the exact phrases they used not aligned with leadership direction, incompatible with new strategic priorities, lack of team cohesion, corporate poetry for, "We want you gone." Janet slid the severance agreement across the table. She tried to soften her voice, telling me it was a generous offer. I didn't pick it up right away. I asked a question instead, calmly, like I was reviewing someone else's termination packet. Was this about the staffing report I sent last month? Her eyes flicked to the VP. He didn't say a word, neither did she. That was answer enough. See, I'd sent an email thread flagged urgent to my boss and the chief medical officer about patient safety risks, short-staffed night shifts that violated policy training records, incomplete float nurses assigned without credential checks. It was the kind of compliance breach that could get us sued or worse, trigger state investigation. They didn't reply, not for 3 weeks. And then here I was, being told I no longer fit the culture. I signed nothing, just collected the packet, told them I'd review it with counsel. I shook Janet's hand because she was following orders, even if it killed me to see her avoid my gaze. Then I walked out without saying another word. The hall felt longer than I remembered. Nurses passed without looking up. A few nodded politely, but most were too busy or too cautious to stop me. HR was just the department that sent reminders no one liked to read. Until you were in trouble. My office was being boxed when I got back. Some new HR assistant I didn't even recognize stood there stacking framed photos of my kids. I asked her to leave them and give me 5 minutes. She did, looking grateful to escape. I closed the door and sat behind my own desk one last time. Opened my email. They'd already revoked access to the shared drives. I couldn't even check the credentialing audit logs I'd flagged. But my personal folder was still open, so I forwarded myself a copy of that entire thread. Subject line: staffing and training compliance concerns. Urgent CCs read receipts, timestamped responses or lack thereof. Policy email thread. My fingers shook slightly. Not rage, not fear. Something colder. A clarity I'd felt only a few times in my career, like when I'd had to dismiss an entire unit's leadership over falsified training records 10 years earlier. They thought they were protecting the hospital. They didn't understand HR knows where all the bodies are buried. Standing up, I smoothed my tie. I left the photos behind but took my notes. Closed the door gently, no point slamming it. I passed Janet on the way out. She didn't meet my eyes. I walked through the main lobby, patients in wheelchairs, families waiting anxiously, nurses at the triage desk calling out names. The hospital kept moving. It always would. But they just made a mistake they couldn't bury. HR has a way of burying the truth to protect themselves. I'm sharing every detail so no one else gets blindsided. Subscribe to follow the whole story. They thought they'd ended my career that morning. That was the day I started planning theirs. I didn't go home right away. I sat in my car in the parking lot for what must have been an hour, engine off, hands on the steering wheel. My phone buzzed a few times. Janet even tried calling once. I let it go to voicemail. 52 years old, and this was how it ended. After 23 years of work, late-night staff mediations, endless policy rewrites, safety trainings, union negotiations, the conference room door still closing behind me played on a loop in my head. I thought about the language they used, not aligned with leadership direction, cultural fit, HR's favorite euphemism for We want you gone, but don't want to say why. I'd use those same words in other people's exit meetings. I wasn't naive about how these things worked. I knew the company didn't care about loyalty or service once you became inconvenient, but knowing didn't make it any easier to swallow. I opened my glove compartment and pulled out the printed copy of the severance packet. I didn't bother reading the amount they thought would make this go away. I went straight to the NDA section. Mutual non-disparagement. No whistleblower carve-out. Cute. It was deliberate. Legal would claim it was boilerplate, but they'd made sure it offered nothing that protected me if I decided to talk. It was a subtle threat: take our hush money or face us alone. I actually laughed once, short and bitter. They really thought I'd fold. I'd worked in HR too long not to see the angles. They hadn't just fired me to save money or make room for someone younger. They'd cut me loose because I'd sent that email about the night shift staffing violations, about training records being incomplete. I could still see the header in my mind. Subject: staffing and training compliance concerns. Urgent. I'd used all caps like an idiot who thought urgency mattered. They hadn't even replied. 3 weeks of silence and then a termination meeting with blinds drawn and 2 signatures waiting. I wasn't sure which stung worse, the betrayal or how predictably corporate it was. I thought about Janet. She used to ask me for advice on employee disputes. She'd taken that HR leadership certificate with my recommendation. She hadn't looked at me once in the room. A chill went down my back then. Not anger, something colder. I knew how these things worked. HR didn't move on something like this alone. It meant there had been meetings, planning, a chain of approvals, legal reviews. They'd set this up. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Like I told employees during conflict mediation when they thought they were about to lose it. I wasn't going to lose it. I was going to remember everything. I took out my personal phone and opened my email. Thank God I'd forwarded that policy email thread before they locked me out. Every line, every timestamp, every name on the CC list. It wasn't enough on its own yet, but it was a start. They'd banked on me being too embarrassed or too tired to fight. On me, signing the NDA and disappearing. I watched the hospital entrance through my windshield, nurses coming in for shift change, visitors carrying flowers. An older man with a cane helped by a volunteer in a red vest. This place wasn't evil. It was worse, it was careless. They wanted the risk buried, because a staffing violation wasn't just a line item on a compliance sheet. It was patients in hallways, overworked nurses missing vitals, errors in medication administration. That's what my email had said. That's what they wanted gone. I leaned back in my seat and let the silence press in. What was the goal here? Honestly, I didn't want to bankrupt the hospital. I didn't want nurses to lose their jobs. I just wanted them to follow the damn rules. They'd written the policies for a reason. I'd helped write them. And they'd thrown me out for actually enforcing them. That was the part I couldn't forgive. I turned the key and started the engine. I wasn't going to sit there feeling sorry for myself any longer. They'd underestimated the old HR guy. They forgot that policy wasn't just words on paper. It was leverage. They'd handed me the blueprint for their own destruction, and I planned to study it very carefully. They thought I'd drive away defeated. I drove home planning my next move. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the old HVAC system, wondering how long it would take before the hospital sent out a sanitized leadership change memo to staff. I imagined Janet rehearsing her lines. Michael has decided to pursue other opportunities. Yeah, sure. By morning, I was done feeling insulted. I was done being confused. I was pissed off, but I knew enough not to show it. Anger was sloppy. Anger left evidence. So I did what I always did. I got organized. I cleared the kitchen table and spread out everything they'd handed me in that little manila envelope. Severance packet termination, letter mutual NDA, even the EAP pamphlet with the 800 number, in case I felt emotionally distressed. I read every line twice. That's the thing they never remember about HR people. We read everything. The severance payment was decent, sure, but tied to the NDA. Signing it meant I'd promised never to say a word about why they fired me. No mention of policy violations. No mention of the email I'd sent with urgent in the subject line. It was hush money with a courtesy letterhead. I took a red pen, old habit, and circled the clause numbers. Then I wrote void on the signature page in block letters and shoved it in my pending folder. They thought I'd roll over. They forgot I'd spent years writing these exact agreements. I opened my laptop next. Personal machine. Not on their network. I logged in and pulled up my personal email. Policy email thread. I read it again line by line. My original complaint complete with CCs to legal and the CMO. My call out of the incomplete staff training records for the night shift float pool. The part where I named the specific nurse whose credential file hadn't been updated since 2018. No one had replied. 3 weeks of documented silence. That wasn't negligence. That was a choice. It hit me then harder than in the parking lot they'd been planning my exit the moment I sent it. I leaned back in my chair, the old joints creaking, and rubbed my temples. Was I really surprised? I'd watched this company bury problems before, sweep complaints under the rug so Joint Commission wouldn't see them, quietly fire whistleblowers and call it a reorganization. And I'd let it happen. That stung more than anything. All those years I'd told myself I was the good HR guy, the one who made things fairer. But I'd signed the damn paperwork before, hadn't I? I shook my head, exhaled slowly. I wasn't going to do it this time. I clicked over to my old personal backups. Funny thing about HR emails, even when they purge your account, they can't delete what you saved off. I'd been at this too long not to keep receipts. I found older threads Janet talking about documenting a pattern on me months back. Coaching notes that looked suspiciously retrofitted, performance discussions that had felt off at the time. I read one email twice, then a third time. We need to ensure Michael's approach aligns with new priorities. Begin documentation. Corporate poetry. That was their strategy. Build a paper trail to justify it later. I felt my mouth curl in a humorless smile. That was my strategy once. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing Janet sitting across from me in that meeting voice, low, unable to look up. I wasn't going to pity her. I understood her. HR was just compliance until it wasn't. It was a shield for the company until they needed a weapon. And now it was my turn to hold the weapon. I opened a blank spreadsheet and began logging every relevant document I had. Policy email thread, coaching notes, HR documentation audits, staff training records flagged as incomplete. That last one mattered most. I pulled the staff training records I'd saved from last quarter, highlighted entries with missing credentialing updates, missing annual safety reviews, names attached. That was their real vulnerability. You can argue about culture fit. You can hand-wave disagreements, but you can't hand-wave staff being untrained around patients. It was the smoking gun they didn't think I had. I sat there for hours line by line building my case. No calls, no music, just the rhythmic click of the keyboard. My cat jumped on the table at one point, stared at the mess of papers, and settled in like he owned it. I scratched his head absently and kept typing. They thought they'd shut me up. They thought this would be over. But stories like this don't get told enough. Share your own experiences and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. They wanted me quiet. I was just getting started. I don't think they ever really understood how I worked. HR isn't just rules and forms. It's memory. It's pattern recognition. I sat at my kitchen table for 2 days straight, with nothing but black coffee, a pile of printouts, and my laptop open to a spreadsheet. The cat gave up trying to claim the papers and settled for the chair next to me. I read everything, twice. It's funny how, at the time, you don't notice the shape of something forming until you go back with the benefit of hindsight. There was that email from Janet, innocuous enough on the surface. Let's make sure Michael's feedback sessions are well documented. I'd thought it was standard coaching language, HR best practices, but paired with another email from the VP to legal, it became clearer, align documentation with performance expectations for potential transition planning. That's the corporate way of saying, build the case. Piece by piece it came together. They hadn't fired me on a whim. They hadn't panicked when I sent that urgent email about the staffing violations and incomplete staff training records. They'd decided to neutralize me. And they'd done it exactly by the book almost. I highlighted phrases in my notes not aligned with leadership direction, culture fit issues, resistance to change. All nonsense but consistent. Carefully chosen, reviewed by legal to pass scrutiny. But the problem with doing things by the book is that the book itself can be used against you. I knew the policies better than anyone. Policy email thread. It was still open on my desktop. I read it for the 100th time. My original message was polite but urgent. It cited actual policy numbers. It included direct references to training requirements and staffing ratios. And they never replied. Silence can be a strategy too, because ignoring it meant they never had to admit it existed. No formal investigation, no paper trail of acknowledging the problem, except I had the email. I scrolled further down and found the old staff training records I'd pulled from backup, missing annual renewals, incomplete credentialing for float nurses, signatures that were supposed to be there but weren't, real liability, not just policy violations, patient safety issues. That's the part they couldn't let get out. I paused, rubbing my temples. Did I really want to be the guy to expose it? Patients wouldn't know me. Nurses might lose their jobs if this went nuclear. The hospital might face fines, audits, lawsuits. But I also thought about the patient who got the wrong meds because an uncredentialed nurse covered a short shift. I didn't know that happened, but I also couldn't swear it hadn't. I let that thought sit like a rock in my gut. They'd forced my hand. They wanted me to choose between shutting up for a paycheck or burning it all down. I wasn't going to make it easy for them. I went back to my spreadsheet, added columns, cross-referenced dates, who sent which email, who was CC'd, which policies were cited, which ones were ignored. Because once you start seeing the pattern, you can't unsee it. They documented me, so I document them. They wrote the plan to get rid of me. I wrote the plan to destroy their defense. My mind worked through the steps like it was a mediation session, calm, methodical. What would they claim? Michael was combative. He refused to adapt. He violated chain of command. What was my counter? The policy email thread with unacknowledged safety concerns. Staff training records proving systemic neglect. HR coaching notes showing they had planned the termination in advance. Their own documentation would bury them. Because in HR, everything leaves a trail. Even when they thought they were covering their tracks, they just laid them out for me to follow. I closed the laptop, flexed my fingers. My joints popped. I'd been doing this too long to be sloppy now. This wasn't about revenge for losing my job. It was about showing them they don't get to write people out of the story just because it's inconvenient. Because compliance isn't optional, and policy cuts both ways. They thought they'd hidden the plan. I just needed to keep reading. I didn't rush. They never understood that about me. They thought HR was just forms and memos and cutting people loose fast enough to avoid risk. But I built my career on patience. You don't last over 20 years in hospital HR without learning to wait for the right moment. So I took my time. I spent the next week quietly gathering no lawyers, yet no official complaint, just me at my kitchen table, a stack of printouts growing higher every night, and my old laptop humming like a tired dog. I started with the policy email thread. I printed it out and read it until the words burned into my head. My message flagged urgent, the line where I cited staffing ratios, the direct references to credential requirements they had ignored. I highlighted every timestamp, every CC. Silence from them was its own reply. Then I dug out the staff training records I'd saved off the system. That was the real danger they were hiding. Not just out-of-date files, but the entire float pool with expired ACLS renewals, missing pediatric certs, no logged annual safety training. These weren't clerical errors, they were liability. One mistake and a patient would pay for it. I found department manager emails asking for grace periods, HR responses, saying they understood the challenges. I read those lines twice. They didn't fix it. They documented that they were ignoring it. I even had a forwarded message from a unit secretary months back. She'd begged me to make them update files because they were getting flagged. At the time, I'd brushed it off as routine. Now, it felt like a confession. I started a spreadsheet, date senders, policy references, direct quotes. I cross-referenced everything. I wasn't collecting gossip, I was building a case. And the more I read, the angrier I got. Not shouting, flipping tables anger. The cold, controlled kind. Because I'd let this happen before. I'd sent my reminders, filed my notes, then accepted their excuses about operational realities. I'd wanted to keep the peace, but they hadn't wanted peace. They'd wanted me gone. I thought about that meeting with Janet, how she couldn't look me in the eye, about the severance clause with the NDA baked in. They were counting on me to take the money and shut my mouth, counting on me to protect them one last time. HR doesn't forget favors or debts. So I didn't plan some angry blast email. I didn't start ranting on Facebook. That's how they'd win, by painting me as unstable or vindictive. I knew that strategy. Hell, I'd used it. I was going to use their words, their documentation, their own rules. I highlighted the whistleblower protection policy from the employee handbook, the one they quoted in orientation like a promise. I stapled it on top of the NDA they had given me. Compassion and integrity right there in corporate font. Then I made a list of names, people who might talk, nurses who'd complained to me, admin staff who'd quietly forwarded files. I wasn't going to drag them in yet, but I needed to know who might back me when it counted. By the end of the week, the binder was thick enough to slam shut with a satisfying snap. Every page was a line they'd written, a promise they'd broken. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt old, tired, but steady in a way I hadn't in years. Because for once I wasn't just playing defense. They thought I'd slink away quietly, but I wasn't done gathering. I didn't announce anything. That was the key. I kept it quiet, kept it boring. I didn't want anyone spooked. I knew how this worked if they caught wind of me planning anything. They'd circle the wagons, shred files, rewrite narratives. HR was great at that. I'd helped do it myself over the years. So I went about it like I was still on the payroll. Calm, professional, methodical. I spent my mornings combing through the binder I'd built line by line, checking for holes. I made sure the policy email thread was flawless. No missing replies, no gaps they could claim were fabricated. I checked the headers, the metadata, printed them on hospital letterhead if I had old copies. The staff training records took longer. Some were hard copies I'd kept out of habit. Others were PDFs from old audit prep folders. I cross-referenced the names, made sure every missing signature or expired cert was dated correctly. No loose ends. That was the advantage of having lived in HR so long. I knew the language. I knew the auditor's expectations. I knew what would make their legal department sweat. In the afternoons, I took calls, former colleagues who hadn't heard yet. A few pretended they didn't know anything. Others offered stiff sympathy. I didn't push. I just listened, noted anything useful. Because people say things when they're uncomfortable. Little admissions slipped out. Yeah, I heard they've been planning to restructure the whole HR team anyway. I think they were told to document you last quarter. They mentioned your email, but said it wasn't an official complaint. That last one stuck with me. Not an official complaint, because they'd ignored it, intentionally. That was the entire defense they'd try to use. I took notes. I didn't argue. At night, I updated my timeline. Every conversation, every quote, every document. It was tedious, boring even, but that was the point. HR loved to weaponize tedium, bury whistleblowers under procedure disclaimers process. I was going to bury them the same way. I kept my tone friendly, didn't threaten anyone, didn't tell them what I was planning. Just an old HR guy checking in, wondering about his benefits, asking if they had heard anything. But I was listening. I knew how these internal games worked. If someone in management got wind of me pulling documents, they'd panic. Start rewriting meeting minutes. Claim old emails were out of context. Purge shared drives. So I played it slow. One day, I sat at my dining room table, half a dozen manila folders spread around me, sipping cold coffee, while the cat snored in the chair. I picked up a page in HR coaching note. Janet's handwriting. Carefully neutral phrases. Michael appears resistant to new leadership direction. Recommend regular documentation of performance conversations. I couldn't help smiling just a little. They'd been thorough, so I would be too. HR always claimed documentation was neutral, just the facts. But facts could be framed, and I was framing them now. They thought they could control the story. I was making sure they couldn't. Because the truth was in the details they had left behind. The silences in the email chain, the missing training signatures. I gathered everything calmly, quietly, without warning them. They were still congratulating themselves on getting rid of the problem. They hadn't even noticed I was still watching. They thought the old HR guy would move on. But I wasn't done preparing. I didn't tell anyone what I had. That was the most important rule. The moment you start bragging about evidence is the moment you lose control of the narrative. I kept my head down. Smiled on the phone when Janet called to check in about the severance offer. She used that fake warm HR voice like we hadn't spent 20 years in the same meetings. I told her I was thinking about it, said I needed time. She thanked me for being professional. That almost made me laugh. Professional. They were counting on that. Counting on me to take the money and go quietly. But while they waited, I worked. I didn't just have the policy email thread and the staff training records. I had notes, coaching logs, performance memos that had magically appeared after I sent that email about staffing violations. I lined them up chronologically. You could see the moment it shifted from mild feedback to deliberate documentation. I highlighted the phrases, not aligned with leadership direction, resistant to change. HR speak for, he's not going to play ball. It was all there. Their strategy to get rid of me, written in careful, legally scrubbed language. The best part, it was their own words. That was what would make it impossible for them to deny. I sat at the table for hours, the cat dozing on a stack of folders. My coffee went cold and then hot again in the microwave. I kept reading, kept making sure nothing was out of place. Because the next step wasn't just to have the evidence. It was to make them know I had it, but carefully. I wasn't going to threaten anyone. That would get back to legal in a heartbeat. They'd twist it, call it extortion, say I was disgruntled and dangerous. No, I decided on something subtler. I sent Janet an email, short, polite. Thanks for sending over the updated severance terms. Before I decide, I'm reviewing all my correspondence, including our coaching records and the staffing compliance emails. I want to be sure I understand everything. I'll be in touch. I sat back and waited. No reply for a day. Then two. Then a third day I got a call from the VP of HR himself. Voice smooth, a little too calm. He asked how I was doing, said he hoped there were no hard feelings. I told him I was fine, that I was being thorough. He didn't ask what I meant, didn't have to, because they understood exactly what I was saying without me saying it outright. That was the beauty of it. They'd trained me to speak their language. I wasn't threatening them. I was reminding them I knew how this game was played. I hung up and noted the time of the call in my binder. Because everything goes in the record. They wanted a fight they could win. A loud, messy blow-up they could spin as me being unstable. I was giving them the opposite. Quiet, calm, documented. They thought they could bury me with HR policy. But I'd spent years writing that policy. And now I was using it against them. They hadn't even begun to panic yet. But they would, because I wasn't done tightening the screws. They didn't expect me to keep my tone polite. That was what threw them. They wanted me angry. They needed me to snap so they could paint me as irrational, the disgruntled ex-employee with an axe to grind. That would have made their job easy. But I'd been in that HR conference room too many times coaching managers on documentation and strategy, reviewing terminations. I knew the playbook, so I stayed calm. After the VP's call, I sent one more email. Courteous, professional. Appreciate you checking in. I'm still reviewing everything I have on file before making a final decision. I'll let you know if I have questions. No threats, no accusations, just a gentle reminder that everything I have on file meant I wasn't bluffing. I pictured them reading it. I knew the meetings it would trigger, legal would get looped in. They'd review every email I'd sent, dissect every phrase, try to figure out if I was serious or bluffing. Because that was the worst thing you could do to HR management, make them uncertain. I kept listening, watching. A couple of old colleagues reached out quietly. They'd heard rumors. One warned me that my old office was cleaned out in a hurry. Another said Janet was having long meetings with legal. That was what I wanted. Pressure without declaration. I wasn't giving them anything they could call extortion. No demand for money, no threat of a lawsuit. Just enough to let them know I had their entire plan in my hands. And they didn't know how much I'd share, so they stalled. The next severance offer came in. Slightly better, still had the NDA, but the amount was higher. I read it, marked it up in red pen like I was reviewing someone else's termination file, and filed it in my binder. They were testing my price. But this wasn't about price anymore. I pulled out the staff training records that night, spread them on the table, highlighted every expired credential, every missing annual safety sign-off. I remembered the nurse who'd asked me about it in the hallway last year. Remembered shrugging and telling her it would get fixed. I'd let this happen because it was easier to stay quiet. Not anymore. The policy email thread was just as damning. My complaint sitting there unanswered, proof they'd seen it and done nothing. They'd documented my supposed attitude problem with HR coaching logs, but they couldn't erase the silence that followed my warning. They'd built a careful paper trail to justify firing me, so I was building mine to justify burying them. I wasn't blind to the risk. I knew legal would go nuclear if I went public, try to spin it as a personal vendetta, blame me for risking the hospital's reputation. But I also knew they couldn't change the facts. I was ready to show every page if I had to. The key was making them wonder whether I would. I kept the tone civil, no threats, no ultimatums. Just polite, measured follow-ups. Thanks for the update. I'll need more time to review the offer given the documentation I'm reviewing. They'd get the message, because HR understands documentation better than anyone. They knew every line in those coaching notes. They knew what my email contained. They knew exactly which policies they had ignored. And they knew that if I shared it with the right people, regulators, unions, state auditors, it wouldn't just be embarrassing, it would be catastrophic. They wanted to negotiate fine, but it would be on my terms. They thought they were managing the risk, but I was the risk now. And I wasn't done letting them feel it. I remember the exact moment I decided there was no going back. I was sitting at the table in the half-dark blinds drawn the glow of my laptop screen, lighting up all the evidence I'd gathered. Pages of the policy email thread, staff training records with missing signatures, coaching notes that were nothing but a trail of corporate cover-your-ass language. I'd been reading them so many times they felt burned into my memory. I could see Janet's careful handwriting in my sleep. Recommend regular documentation. Monitor resistance to new leadership direction. That was the line that finally made me close the file and sit back hands folded, breathing slowly. Because that's when I remembered why this started. Not the firing, not the NDA, the patience. That's what no one wanted to talk about. I hadn't sent that original email to make waves. I hadn't wanted to threaten anyone or make a name for myself. I'd sent it because I was scared that someone would get hurt. The night shifts were dangerously short-staffed. The float nurses were being reassigned to critical care without updated credentials. We had new hires who hadn't even completed basic safety training. I'd seen the error logs, medication mishaps caught just in time, patients waiting too long for post-op monitoring, nurses pushed past safe ratios. It wasn't hypothetical. It was real risk. When I'd first raised it, I'd been careful, respectful. I cited policies, gave them the evidence. And they ignored it. No reply, no corrective plan, just silence for weeks, until I was called in and handed a severance packet. They didn't even bother pretending it was about the complaint. They just started documenting my attitude. I felt my jaw tighten thinking about it, because that was the real reason they fired me. Not because I was difficult, because I wouldn't shut up about a problem that could kill someone. And they needed me gone before I took it outside the building. I stood up from the table and walked to the window, staring out at my quiet street. A couple of kids rode bikes under the streetlights. Sprinklers clicked on in someone's yard. Meanwhile, they were betting no one would ever see what I'd saved. They thought they could buy my silence with a bigger severance check. But I wasn't for sale anymore. I went back to the table, spread the papers out, and began highlighting. Not just policy citations, but the dates, the unanswered warnings, the proof they'd chosen to do nothing. Because they hadn't just fired me. They'd gambled with patient safety to keep the numbers looking good. They were hoping I'd stay ashamed, afraid to look vindictive. But you don't get to bury the truth just because it's inconvenient. I opened a new document and started drafting my formal complaint. Not to them, to the state regulators. I knew the whistleblower channels. I'd trained staff on how to use them. I knew exactly what I needed to make it stick. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused, because this was no longer about saving my job or salvaging my reputation. It was about making sure they never got to make that choice again. They'd gambled no one would call them out. I was about to make sure they lost that bet for good. Filing the complaint wasn't satisfying. It wasn't some dramatic moment of victory. It felt clinical, methodical, like every other piece of paperwork I'd processed in HR over the years, except this time I wasn't protecting the hospital. I sat there at my kitchen table with the state's online reporting portal, open reading every instruction twice, making sure every field was filled in perfectly. No room for dismissal on a technicality. I attached the policy email thread, highlighting the dates, the CCs, the total lack of response. I attached scans of the staff training records showing credential gaps, expired certs, missing safety training logs. I included the coaching notes they had used to force me out, complete with the sudden shift in tone right after my complaint. I explained the timeline in the plain direct language. No threats, no insults, just facts. Because that was what they couldn't argue with. When I hit submit, there was no moment of triumph, just a quiet sinking certainty. I knew what would happen next. Regulators don't move fast, but they do move, especially when you hand them a case gift wrapped with policy citations and internal documentation. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I thought about Janet, about the VP of HR, about the nursing managers who signed off on incomplete records because they didn't want to deal with pushback, about the patients who would never know how close they'd come to disaster. My phone buzzed. Another email from legal. They'd followed up on my concerns with a fresh severance offer, higher than before, still with the NDA attached. I didn't even open the attachment, because that wasn't the point anymore. They still thought this was a negotiation. It wasn't. It was accountability. I thought about the HR meetings I'd sat in over the years, watching colleagues squirm when confronted with their own words on paper, watching them realize documentation cuts both ways. That's what I'd built here. Not a rant, not a threat, a record. And now it was in the hands of people who couldn't afford to ignore it. I closed my laptop, stood up. My knees cracked the way they always did. I picked up the binder I'd spent weeks building and thumbed through the pages one last time. Every email, every training record, every coaching note. Their story written in their words. They thought they could hide it forever, but I just made sure someone was going to read it, and there was no NDA in the world big enough to stop that. They hadn't realized what kind of HR guy they were firing, but they were about to find out. I didn't expect to hear anything right away. State investigators aren't known for speed, but they are known for thoroughness. And when they started asking questions, the hospital panicked. I heard about it in fragments at first. A former colleague called me, voice low, half whispered, like she was worried someone would overhear, even over the phone. She said there were compliance reviews happening on the night shifts, random file audits, mandatory meetings about documentation standards. Another friend in nursing told me HR had started sending frantic reminders about credential renewals. Suddenly, the training logs that had sat untouched for months were the top priority. They were trying to clean it up, but it was too late. Because they couldn't scrub the timeline, couldn't erase the email I'd sent with urgent in the subject line, listing policy violations, chapter and verse. Couldn't erase the date stamps, showing they ignored it for 3 weeks before starting their little documentation campaign to get rid of me. Couldn't erase the state's investigators now combing through everything. The calls started getting less friendly. Janet tried once more, voice tight, asking if I'd considered the latest offer. It was the highest yet. I told her I appreciated the gesture, said I'd think about it. I didn't mention I'd already filed the complaint. No threats, no anger, just polite. I wanted them guessing, because HR hates uncertainty. I got a text from an old admin assistant who'd always been good at sniffing out the truth. She said she heard the VP of HR was on leave pending review. That made me sit down for a moment, not out of satisfaction, but because I'd known that man for years. Shared bad conference coffee, laughed about ridiculous policy updates. He was the one who'd signed my termination paperwork. He'd chosen his side. They all had. I didn't enjoy knowing he'd pay for it, but I also didn't regret it because it wasn't personal revenge anymore. It was accountability. I spent that night rereading the binder I'd built. Their words, their signatures, their silence. They'd counted on my shame, counted on my fear, counted on my willingness to keep the ugly truth buried because it would be easier. But the thing about HR is we remember everything. We save everything. I hadn't been some rogue employee trying to blow up the system. I just refused to lie. And now they were watching the house of cards they had built start to fall one policy violation at a time. I set the binder down carefully. They thought firing me would end the problem. All it did was prove it existed, and I wasn't done watching them deal with that truth. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like paperwork, like closure forms and investigation summaries, like the dry language I'd spent decades perfecting to avoid lawsuits and keep things professional. The state sent me an acknowledgement, formal, cold, exactly as it should be. They didn't thank me. They didn't need to. It wasn't about gratitude. It was about the record. That's what mattered. They were investigating. I heard from friends inside that the hospital brought in outside consultants, policy reviews, emergency compliance training. Some senior managers quietly resigned. Janet stopped calling. The VP of HR took early retirement. Nobody said it was because of me. That's not how these places work. They just moved on like nothing had happened. But they knew. And I knew. I kept the binder in a drawer even after it was over. I didn't shred it. Didn't need to. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was evidence. Proof that sometimes doing the right thing meant not shutting up, no matter how polite they told you to be. I sat at my kitchen table one last time, flipping through those pages. The policy email thread, still with the original urgent subject line. The staff training records, every gap highlighted. The coaching notes they'd used to paint me as resistant. All of it real. All of it theirs. I thought about the patients, about the night shifts, about the nurses who'd whispered they were scared to speak up. That was who I'd done it for. Not for revenge, for them. So they'd know someone noticed. Someone cared enough to make it stop. It cost me my career, my professional reputation, probably any reference they'd ever give. But some things are worth that. I stood up, closed the binder, and put it away. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. But I'd do it again. Because policy only matters when someone's willing to enforce it. And sometimes HR isn't there to protect the company. Sometimes it's there to protect everyone else from the company. Thanks for hearing my story. Subscribe if you want to know these things can really happen. Don't let anyone tell you to stay quiet just to make them comfortable, because silence is exactly what they're counting on.